Good morning and welcome to Governance Live here at the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute. This is a series we started some years ago leading up to Governance Week. And this year we had such amazing conversations with some of our guests here at Governance Live that we have chosen to continue with our conversations. And more so, this month of July is our anniversary month here at the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute as we become 12 years old since establishment. And it is a time that we are taking to share a governance live with some of our directors. And today we have, in fact, a very, very special guest. He is Professor Bob Garratt, and Professor Garratt is the CCGI's Global Ambassador. He is someone who has really contributed immensely to the growth of the Institute over the last 5 years. He has connected us with an amazing number of persons globally, many of the most influential names in corporate governance who have attended CCGI events and shared their knowledge and experiences with us as well. So it's a great pleasure for us to have him on Governance Live this morning. Just before I bring him on, though, I'd like to share that one of the major influences that we've had from Professor Garratt is this year, he invited me to read this wonderful book. It's called The Smart States Club, and it's all about how smart states can save the world, written by former president of Armenia, Mr. Armen Sarkisian. And in this book, the former president shares his personal experiences with a lot of countries where he served as ambassadors and countries which he said was able to deal with many of the internal challenges of culture in their own environment, but also navigate the very complex geopolitics of the external environment to build wonderful countries that are considered developed in today's world. Many of these states include, for instance, he has Botswana as one of those countries, Switzerland, United Arab Emirates. And so Professor Garratt was sharing that we should look at learnings from these countries to help us in the Caribbean region be able to grow our own agility, our own nimbleness in being able to adeptly maneuver those rapid changes that's happening in the external environment, but also take charge of our destiny in terms of the way we ourselves understand our challenges and build on our strengths so that we can be counted among those smart states that can save the world. And I want to share, just before we bring on Professor Garratt, the fact that we would be hosting a one-day conference next week, Thursday. That's July 25th. This conference is entitled Governance of Small States, and it is meant to be the catalyst for us to create an alliance of small states that's going to help us be able to share lessons learned and build a network of persons who will be able to support each other in navigating this complex environment. So just quickly, I'd like to share among the countries that would be represented and the speakers for this Governance of Small States conference next week. Our main speaker would be Charlotte Valère, and Charlotte is in fact a former director of the Institute, the former chair, I should say, of the Institute of Directors out of the UK. And she has facilitated several workshops for us at CCGI, along with having been one of our opening speakers for Governance Week. We also have Dr. Wada Al-Hashmi, who is chairman of the United Arab Emirates GCC BDI's Chapter Advisory Board, someone who also has been a guest here at CCGI this year and who really brings some wonderful, amazing experiences. We also have Mfo Kosi Sile from Botswana, She's a governance professional who has done more than 20 years work in the African region and really very experienced. They would be joined by Ali Matalon of Jamaica, and they would be looking at the whole issue of ESG, sustainability, and the climate agenda, and the way in which this would impact small states. And we have a second panel that's going to look at technology, AI, and blockchain. The speakers include a gentleman from Switzerland, and I have to confess, I'm still to learn from him the correct pronunciation of his name. But we also have Edwin Ward, who is a former chairman of the Institute of Directors from Malta, and Louis Kingley, who is co-founder and CEO of LinkMe from the US, who will be speaking on that second panel. So our objective for this conference will be to create an informal alliance of small states. And that idea was first shared by Charlotte Vallet. It is totally in sync with a lot of the work Professor Bob Garratt has been doing with us in the Caribbean region. And so we would also include in that one-day conference the Namibia experience with Esha Luanda, who is the former president and in fact the founder of the Institute of Directors out of Namibia. So just to share, we are going to have a really amazing conference, which we hope is going to be the catalyst for some global changes in the way small states relate with each other and navigate this changing world. At this time, however, I want to go to our very beloved, our global ambassador, Professor Bob Garratt, who, as I said, has been such an inspiration and an influential figure for us here at the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute. Good morning and welcome to you, Professor Garratt.
Some break thing type of growth, because that in the end is, I would argue in medical terms, that is cancerous.
Right.
The only thing that a cancer wants to do is to keep growing, because that's the only way it sustains itself. That is a nonsense for human organizations. So how do we develop an approach which allows that balance? And if you think about most plants, their growth is actually quite balanced. Some of it has to die, some of it has to get quite big. Generations coming behind who are going to, they really will inherit a much physically tougher world. And we need to really think about them. And I see that generation, the ones I'm working with, and I've just started a new short visiting professorship in the new Islamic University in Indonesia. So lovely young people, they're in their master's or PhD level now, very, very keen on the world's fastest growing Islamic country. Very excited, very, very open-minded, remarkably open-minded about how the future is going to be. And, I think the sort of work we can do must involve them, but they have things to learn from us as well. By the way, a small thing I meant to mention at the beginning, Charlotte Valeur is not just another Brit going to tell us what to do. She's not like that at all, because, first of all, she's Danish, which is a small state in its own right. And second, for many, many years, she's been a resident of Guernsey, which is another small state. So her connection with the mainland Britain is relatively slim. So she, I think, would be a very good chair, because she's very active, very international. But she has in the back of her mind two very small states. Denmark has been particularly successful, both socially, economically, and to an extent, environmentally. So I think she would be a very good chair to help us all learn how to take this very important area forward.
Yes, and I am happy to share that we also have been getting very positive responses from persons. In fact, yesterday, the former chair of the Institute of Directors out of Namibia,
Mm.
I think Escher Luanda, reached
Yeah.
out and said he wanted to share his story in having founded the Institute of Directors there and, helping it to grow into a successful institute. And he's also helping to influence a number of other African countries in developing their corporate governance as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
We would be inviting him to also share some of his stories at the conference next week, Thursday.
Good. Excellent. Well done. I didn't know that. Well done. Yeah.
Yes, he reached out to me only yesterday. So, and I thought that that would be an excellent way because it's important to not just be inclusive, but as I mentioned, finding that right balance of
Mm.
persons share common values so that we are all about developing a better world that allows for conversations rather than what we are seeing right now, which is, more and more wars. And unfortunately, when through you, we've been able to get Gillian Tett to speak at last year's global conference.
Mm.
She warned that this is the future that we will have to live with
Yes.
because historically it's so difficult for countries to be able to solve problems, with diplomacy. And so we are seeing so many things happening that poses a threat even to human existence.
Mm. Yeah.
So I wanted to also ask your thoughts about another looming area, and that is artificial intelligence. Uh, because even as we try to get people to talk together and build collaborations and doing things, we are seeing artificial intelligence coming in that is being given a lot of the responsibilities in mining data and sharing what for some persons is decisions in how things are done. So, one, I wanted to get your thoughts on that because I know you feel very strongly about the way artificial intelligence is being treated. And then we'll move on a little bit more to another concern I have with technology.
Okay. Well, yes, I think I've talked with the Institute before about my concern, which is artificial intelligence as it is developing at the moment is neither really artificial, certainly not intelligent. And so it's one of those wonderful fads where everybody thinks it's great, and the big money in the States, particularly in California, piles into it. They move fast and break things. And they're breaking a lot of things, but what they're breaking is a whole cultural element. So my concern is that, yes, you can create, massive learning systems, but I would argue they don't really learn. The algorithms are so crude still that you can have an awful lot of data, but to turn data information into information is a very subtle, a very human activity. And so you can mechanize that to a great extent. But my worry is that in doing that, and it was on the BBC this morning actually when I was having my breakfast. There were companies saying we want to have a law that says to big tech, especially AI, we do not want to be robbed.
Right.
And that's what's been going on. I mean, the creation of these mammoth databases is actually just good old-fashioned banditry. There's no permission, there's no intellectual property rights being respected. They're just being run over, and the machines are just able to, in their, as they call it, scrape everything that's around. It's like trawling the bottom of the seabed. You're not looking for particular fish or anything. You're just scraping everything up, seeing what comes up, throwing most of it away or dumping it. But in doing that, now I would admit immediately a personal bias because the title of my new book was going to be shining a light on a naughty world. And that's a straight quote from Portia in The Merchant of Venice. But when the publishers ran it through many databases, it came up as potential or actual pornography.
Right.
I was to say
Because it's
that,
not intelligent.
I was to say that he's bloody angry. But no, it's the word naughty spelt in the Shakespearean way. And this is what happens when you have people creating the databases who are not very bright, and certainly not very well educated. And many of them I've been rude about, sitting in their shorts at 3 a.m. in the morning, munching burgers, living with their mother, and not having any notion of what's going on in the outside world. Um, so I am very biased on that, but generally on AI, I think there has to be a lot of regulation brought in now, and a lot of compensation to be paid back to the many, and it's not just individual databases, but the national databases and the historic databases, which frankly, I would argue they have raped.
Mm.
And this is a highly controversial area at the moment, but it's one that we've got to face up to, because you do get some extraordinarily stupid answers if you're using AI. Extraordinarily stupid answers. Yeah. So
And
have I had my rant on that?
yes, but now I want to take it just a step further, because I really love how you have very clearly indicated this is not intelligence, right? This
Yes.
is
Yes.
data being mined. And so we do need to have the human intelligence. And so if we take the example of the post office scandal in the UK,
Yep.
where the technology was spitting out certain results,
Yes.
and the human mind did not take the time to assess the accuracy of it. It was taken for granted
Yes.
that this is the information, and therefore how many families suffered as a result of poor decision making because of reliance on the technology.
Yeah. Well, I agree, and the court case still goes on, and now we're in the really difficult part, which is where the directors and the senior managers and the senior technologists are now being quizzed, and they are not having a good time of it. I mean, most of them are saying sorry, but what does that mean? Um, the We haven't got to the crux yet. I think the crux is when the prosecuting lawyers get right back to the role of the director and the role of the board. And we're nearly there now. But they've been going through the individuals and their role. But in the end, they're going to have to ask questions about the system. And it was very obvious that that board was not functioning. It was friends and uh, party political appointments being brought in to into something that wasn't seen as very important at all. That was a nice, cushy job to do on that board. I have spoken with one of the prosecuting counsel about this privately, and she admits that we still have to get down to the basis of the corporate governance side. What were they doing in terms of the 7 roles of a board of a director, and what were they doing in relation to the 5 aspects of running an effective board? And it's obvious that they weren't. That's all there is to it. So what they were doing was relying on the technology, and the technology was faulty. But it's back to social sciences. Nobody was willing to say, hang on a second, can there really be that number, those many hundreds of corrupt postmasters? And if so, how are we employing these people? Well, you were employing them because they were good people who were passing all the tests. What was not passing the test was the quality of the data I would say much of it wasn't proper information coming out of the technology. And nobody seemed to have the personal courage or the intellectual oversight to say, hang on a minute, this is not intelligent what we're doing. This is basically anti-humanitarian. And yeah, I'm very worried by that. I mean, to me, though, the social silence still continues in part because many of the politicians involved do not want to open this up in the way that it's being opened up, thank God, through the legal system. Because they will all be involved, and they will be involved about the questions they did not ask and the intelligent oversight they did not use, rather than the questions they did ask.
And I too think that that would be a really compelling case study for directors moving forward to understand how they are to fulfill their role of oversight. Because as you mentioned, that this is where the direction that the case is headed. It reminds me that we do have a lot of other examples of large organizations where there was found to be wrongdoing. They've been fined, by national agencies, but the boards have remained untouched.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have not presented that accountability all the way.
Yes. Yes. And we know, in the end, in governance, there are just three fundamental human values that are needed. One is accountability, personal accountability. Two is probity or honest dealing. And three is transparency, not hiding things, not being secret, but being open in the behaviors and the decisions that are taken. And those three seem to get lost still, although I'm delighted these court cases, and I refer you back to the FTX case around the cryptocurrency, because that is one thing the Americans do. I'm often very rude about the Americans, but one thing they do well is fast court cases and very open court cases. So anybody studying the Silicon Valley for their total contempt for corporate governance will see the consequences beautifully written out there.
Very good. And I'm happy to share some good news from the Caribbean side. In Jamaica, there's been what I consider to be a very revolutionary approach where the government of Jamaica has passed a law requiring that all persons who would be appointed to state boards must first demonstrate that they've had some training in governance.
I think that is wonderful. I hope you are very involved in that in some way or another. But that is exactly what we need. I mean, 20 years ago, when Chris Pearce and I and some friends set off to develop the Chartered Director in the UK, it looked as though that was going to be not an easy run, but a pretty successful run. But in the end, the politicians, having agreed everything and help us set the system up, then never ever wanted any of the cases to go to court, because they didn't want the precedents set at law.
Right. So just to share, in
What
Jamaica,
other Jamaicans? Yeah.
It is the private sector organization of Jamaica, the PSOJ, which really can be given the majority of credit for the work done with their government and building awareness and sticking to their guns in trying to get this law in place. CCGI had no role with that. I'm hoping the role we can play is to share that as an excellent example within the region, that we may have all of our other governments follow suit, because many of our state enterprises is where a lot of the challenges lie. And if we don't have proper governance all the way from the top, then we'll continue to have these challenges.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Good.
how do we take charge of our own future? How do we ensure that we don't feel compelled to just be tossed around by the changing environment, but ensure that we develop smart people so we bring to the boardroom that ability to provide leadership that we can have smart states in the Caribbean region.
Yeah.
That's our challenge, Professor Garratt.
Well, and I'm hoping that you will become, if you like, a central agency for moving this learning rapidly around the system. And I know Charlotte will be very, very keen to do that. Now, how you actually do that, I don't know the resources you have, but I'm not too worried about that because with a lot of the internet, the electronics we have nowadays, it is very easy to set up some sort of agency system by which ideas can flow instantly around the system. But then you also need at least one person behind that who, if you like, is the curator of the system. So they don't lose all the wonderful ideas as they flow through, but they're actually logging them and looking at the patterns that are being created and then feeding back into the system the way those patterns are developing and the way some of the weird and wonderful ideas are developing. So that you've got an agency, but you've got a curator who has the time and the intellectual capacity to pull together a lot of that learning and then help you move it on quickly. That's the challenge, I think, for next week. So
Yes, and I'm glad you have outlined that
yeah,
specifically and what the tasks are. So we now have to develop
yeah,
the action plan for it.
yeah.
So I was happy you mentioned Dr. Chris Pierce earlier as well. I know we have gone past our usual half hour with Governance Live, but I'm hopeful Janet doesn't mind that we are taking a little more of your time here with us.
I cannot see her in the other room, so I'm still hogging her studio. Hmm?
Right. Okay. So I do want to take a few minutes to ask you to reflect, on the work. I mean, you have done amazing work in this field of corporate governance over the last few decades. Some of which has had such great positive impact. Certainly for us in the Caribbean, it has. Um, as you think back, what are some of the things that you would feel happy about? And I know you have expressed this great desire of what the next generation is likely to do. We are happy to have you be able to continue that influence. But for a few minutes, just share with us your reflections on some of what you have done and how you feel today, looking back at the corporate governance landscape.
Oh, right. I wasn't expecting that question. And I feel both happy and very sad.
Hmm.
Over 40 years. On the one hand, I think the ideas are now much more refined and much more practical, particularly around those three values I mentioned, around the ways in which we need to take up responsibility, we need to be honest dealing, the way we need to be transparent in what we're doing, and the way in particularly in which the seven roles of the director are now much clearer. So, but including independence of thought, including absolutely crucial, the need to ensure the future health of the company rather than of the shareholders. Absolutely fundamental notion. And then the ways that is translated through developing effectively your personal effectiveness through your skills, your attitudes, your behaviors, and then the way in which within those seven you are also being honest. You're declaring any interests. You're making sure you're not involved in third-party transactions, etc. So those 7, I'm delighted that those have stood the test of time and are being developed in a lot of countries in various ways now. But and the aspects of the board of directors to first ensure that the company has a future, and that future involves ownership in various ways, but not necessarily, sorry, not at all the supremacy of shareholders. They're not the key beings in an organization, but also the way in which the whole notion of ownership has developed much more into stakeholders, and the way that is already in a number of countries' laws now, even over the last 20 years, that the stakeholders include the employees, include the local community, include the environment, and include the suppliers, and obviously, in the end, the customers or clients. And those things I'm very happy with. My unhappiness is that even when you get all of those working very well, and you have tremendous effects over a shortish period, 5 or 6 years, as the board changes, unless the people appointing new members of the board are very thoughtful in their choice, it can go horribly wrong within about 18 months. And so some of my sadness is seeing what I thought were going to be great institutions crash, mainly because of political appointments who just didn't understand what the law was, didn't care what the law was, and proceeded to create a lot of trouble. I mean, the worst case that I have personally been involved in, and I've written about this, was Transnet in South Africa, which was this huge, absolutely massive state-owned enterprise that ran all the railways, ran all the ports, and ran the oil and gas pipelines. And in 6 years, under the chairmanship of Fred Fasmana and the chief executive of Maria Ramos, totally, and also at the same time having to start a new type of board because of Black economic empowerment. So having to take 40% new directors on who were Black, young-ish, and frankly didn't have much mathematics because apartheid law had forbidden them from learning mathematics after 10 years old. But taking those on board and getting that into a really, really exciting board and a really exciting company, which have been the bane of the economy of South Africa because their wretched trucks kept falling off the rails and all sorts of things like this. Turning that round in 6 years was amazing. But then when President Zuma came in and the Gupta brothers began to have a massive influence within 18 months on the awarding of contracts, and the contracts for those companies were huge, the whole thing fell apart horribly fast. Within 2 or 3 years, the good people left, the bad people forgot everything that had been taught and learned. And so I always have very mixed feelings about my corporate governance career. That's one extreme case. I stress it is extreme, but I was never, in truth, I've never seen, the perfect company, and I don't think there ever will be.
Mm-hmm. I think that's an excellent answer. And you know what? It is so useful for us moving forward that you have captured a lot of those in your books. I must mention your best-selling, The Fish Rot Head, which dissected this whole notion of the tone at the top, and you spoke about the learning board and the importance of what directors do. But then you recognize that even putting the information out there is not sufficient. We're not going to have directors, read and absorb it. And you follow that with Stop the Rot, where you gave very, very precise recommendations in terms of what boards can do so that they can function better. Truthfully, human beings, being what we are. And I'm fond of going back to Adam Smith and what he said all the way back in 1776, so long as we are if we will not look at other people's money with the same vigilance with which we watch our own.
That is true.
Yes, and so human nature too is, we have to really always be mindful, be open to learning, and as you say, be transparent. And so we look forward to your next book, which I'm sure is going to really help keep so many of us grounded and focused, certainly into the next generation, because clearly this is an ongoing battle.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Kamla.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor.
Enjoy next week.
Yes, absolutely. And I look forward to having you there as well as we
Yes.
engage in governance of small states next week, Thursday, July 25th. It's an online conference on Zoom. We'd have representatives from Botswana, Switzerland, Namibia, the UK, Malta, the United Arab Emirates, so many different countries, several of which are countries that are captured in this amazing book, The Small States Club. I want to encourage everyone to read it. Professor Garratt recommended it to me earlier this year. And as we read it, those of us who live in small countries, it's really inspiring. It helps us to recognize that it takes time, but we can make a difference. So we don't feel hopeless in the whole battle. So this has been Governance Live here at the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute. Thank you, all of you who have joined the live stream, and thank you to the many of you who would be viewing this afterwards. We continue to hope that you will join us as we focus on our core purpose, which is improving corporate governance practices in the Caribbean region. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye
Thank
now.
you.